Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. I really hate to turn off that music. That was Eitan Katz from his Live in Jerusalem concert, singing Shomer Yisrael, the Guardian of Israel, referring to the Holy One. I was actually doing family errand at the mitzvah store, Rabbi Shimon Kraft's store here in Los Angeles. And for those familiar with the accidental Talmudic story, that's where it happened. Way back in the year 2005, when I happened to buy book one of the Talmud on day one of the Daf Yomi cycle. It happened in Rabbi Kraft's store. So I was happy to be there today. Anything I need to buy Jewish that I buy in LA, I would buy from him. And that song was playing today when I was in the store. And I learned that Eitan Katz, whose father is Avshalom Katz, formerly the cantor, the Chazan at Beth Jacob here in Los Angeles. Shlomo Katz, his brother, I often play his music. Eitan and Shlomo Katz are brothers. Their father was a cantor. They both have recorded many albums of Jewish music. And they grew up in LA. And what I didn't know is that Eitan Katz worked at the mitzvah store at some point. And so they look at him with great pride and play his albums all the time. At any rate, let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning on a Thursday evening? Stephen in New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Yehuda in South Carolina, John in Sedona, Bill in Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, New York, Paula in Chicago, Christo in Lubbock, Renee in Indiana, John in Maine, Lucy in Minnesota, Paul in the Northwest, Belle in Central Illinois, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Judy in North Carolina, David in Notre Dame, Indiana, PK in Colorado. Welcome, everybody. So where are we holding this? I had mentioned 2 days ago, because we didn't do a class yesterday, because I went to this amazing training that we had, kind of LAPD honoring our volunteer security force for synagogues, called Magen Am. So our founder, Rabbi Yossi Elfert, received a certificate. And then, since we all, carry firearms and show, and we go through a lot of training for that, we were invited to actually do a little extra training at the LAPD Force Option Simulator. Amazing, where you stand in front of this very large screen and they take you through reenactments of real world scenarios where police are responding and have to make that nanosecond decision. Do I fire my weapon at what looks to be a criminal or an attacker, an assailant, etc.? The situation I happen to face, just so awful to imagine it, but of course it's happened in the world, an active shooter in a school. And police called to respond, and students fleeing, bodies on the ground, and then you finally find the attacker, and you have to shoot him. And is he hiding behind a corner? Is he hiding behind an object that you can shoot through? Can you get, your sight alignment and sight picture and actually hit the bad guy when you're under that tremendous pressure? And I had already made peace with, this is so difficult, I'm going to make a fool of myself. But I'm happy to report that yours truly, your accidental Talmudist, went under pressure at LAPD headquarters in the Force Option Simulator. I hit the bad guy. In fact, I happened to face two bad guys. Another one came around the corner and I hit both of them. And so in a real world, I would have saved lives of students, thank God. At any rate, that's why we didn't have a class yesterday. We were going to do a double daf today, a double page today to get back on schedule. But in preparing for today's class, I saw that today's page, page 21, here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Sukkot. Now we're in chapter 2. And we're discussing what does it mean when we say we have an obligation, a Jew has an obligation to reside in a sukkah during Sukkot. What does it mean to reside in the sukkah? How do we fulfill that obligation? Today's page is just one of those pages. It's really good. It's really rich. And we're going to do the whole page. So, and it's not a super short page either. So it did not make sense to do 2 pages today. We actually will get to Mishna number 2 and start covering that. But today we're going to cover everything that is written on this page. We often omit stuff for the purposes of our class. We don't try to do the complete daf. Would take the liberty of when it makes sense to go in deep on one subject or to bring in other sources or stories, etc. And to omit stuff that's overly technical and maybe not appropriate for our student body, as it were. But today, it's a great page, and we're going to do the whole page. So, and tomorrow, the 2 pages which follow, 22 and 23, they're both short, and it would make much more sense to do the double daf tomorrow. Okay, so we start at the bottom of the B side of page 20. And we already 2 days ago started talking about this Mishna. So to summarize the Mishna, and when we're talking about how do you reside in the Sukkah during Sukkot, so one who sleeps beneath his bed in the Sukkah did not fulfill his obligation, says the Mishnah. And then we clarified, what does that mean? If you sleep under your bed, but there's less than 10 handbreadths between the floor and the bed where you're underneath it, so that's not a significant space, and we're not going to call that a tent, right? So if it's a significant space, then it is a tent, and then that would nullify you fulfilling your obligation of sleeping in the sukkah, which really means sleeping under the schach of the sukkah, meaning the roofing of the sukkah. The roofing is the significant and definitive attribute of the sukkah, tied to the clouds of glory. When the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, those clouds of glory that kept the beating sun off of us during the 40 years that we wandered. So the roofing must be natural, plant matter that is cut from the ground, no longer attached to the ground, and it must provide more shade than sunlight, but it has to provide sunlight. In other words, light gets through. You can see the sky through it, but it has to provide more shade than light. Rabbi Yehuda said that when he was a kid, they used to sleep under the beds before the elders, so you can fulfill your obligation if you're under the bed, and that's where we get to, yes, but it's only if it's 10 handbreadths or more that the space beneath the bed becomes like a tent. If it's less than that, then you're just kind of under your bed, almost as if you were on top of the bed, but the bed in that situation does not interpose. And then there was this incident of Rabban Gamliel, who mentioned, and Rabbi Shimon cites this incident when he heard the conversation of Rabban Gamliel, not giving a legal ruling, a halachic ruling, but just talking about how his beloved slave, the slave of his household, and slavery is awful, disgusting, wrong in every way, but the way that slavery existed in the ancient world is different than what we call slavery today. It was coming from a more ancient world in which slaves were just subhuman in every way. And then the Torah came and granted rights to the slaves so that you couldn't mistreat your slaves and handle them in a subhuman way. That's obviously a subject for another day. But at any rate, the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, Rabban Gamliel, in his household, had a slave, which is more like, somebody who's like going to work in that household all his life, but is really a member of the family and a very learned member of the family. And Rabban Gamliel said that, his slave Tavi, who knows the Torah inside and out, he could sleep under the bed because he is not obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah because he is not a master of his own time since he is a slave. And then in passing, we're going to learn from that story a little bit. That was the Mishnah. And then the Gemara started by saying, right, so you don't fulfill your obligation to sleep in the sukkah if you're sleeping under a bed and that bed is more than 10 handbreadths above the floor. If it's less than 10 handbreadths, it's not a significant space, and you do fulfill your obligation. Now we continue. The Gemara comments, we learned in a Mishnah there with regard to the impurity of a tent. So that's the idea that if you're in a tent and a person who's in that tent with you dies, so that you are now sharing the space underneath the roof of a tent with a human corpse, then you and every other object in that tent that's under the same roof with the corpse is going to become tameh, ritually impure. So we learned in a Mishnah there with regard to the impurity of a tent that both a hole that was perforated in a rock by water or by creeping animals, or a hole in a rock that was perforated because it was eaten away by salt, and likewise a space in a course of stones, and likewise a space in a pile of beams, all have the legal status of a tent over impurity. Meaning, a source of impurity imparted by a corpse transmits impurity to other objects in those spaces as they constitute a tent over a corpse. So what we're saying here is, what is the definition of a tent, right? We understand if it's made out of canvas or some other kind of material with tent poles and tent pegs and ropes that hold it up and what we normally call a tent. Okay, we get it. But what about a space that has a roof and that was not created to be a tent, but nevertheless it has an interior? And I actually have this new book that is going to help us understand some of these figures. So here we have a space under a rock created by water, right? Ocean water wearing away rock and creating like a little cave under that rock ledge. Here, let me see it. Right, and here we have like animals carving out a space, which now creates an interior. In both of these cases, we have a space that is an interior with a roof that was not created by humans to be a tent, but nevertheless, it creates a space that if there is a person or an object and a dead body in there, then it's going to impart tuma by sharing a tent. This is going to be, and then here we have this idea of you have a stack of rocks, and there's a space in there, right? So that's space, or a stack of beams, and there's a space created in there. So these are at least are the space results from objects that were manufactured by people, as opposed to water eroding in a cave out of rock, or an animal carving out a burrow from dirt or some other material. But in all these cases, it was not a carved out space with an interior that was set up to be a tent. But now we learn that it doesn't matter if you have essentially a roof, and underneath that roof, a person and another person, and one of them dies. So then, even though you didn't touch the corpse, the living person didn't touch the human corpse, because he shares a roof with them, they're going to contract ritual impurity according to this law in the Torah that one who is inside a tent with a corpse is going to become impure through tent/corpse impurity, right? That body of law. Okay, now why are we learning that? Because we're going to start to apply this to this idea of, well, is it a tent? If you're under the bed, it wasn't intended to be a tent, but as we see with these spaces, they weren't intended to be a tent either, but the law of sharing a tent with a corpse applies to those spaces. And Rabbi Yehuda says, the legal status of any tent that is not established by a person, like the cave carved away by water or the burrow carved away by an animal, the legal status of any tent that is not established by a person, by human interference, is not that of a tent and does not transmit the corpse impurity of a tent. And the Gemara asks, well, what is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? From where did he derive that halakha? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you find yourself in a cave, right, that was created by water eroding the space in the rock with another person and he died, and you didn't touch the corpse, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, you would not become tameh by virtue of sharing a tent with a corpse. It wouldn't apply to you because this was not created by humans, like tents are created by humans. Where does Rabbi Yehuda get this law? Now we're at the top of the A side of page 21. So he derives by means of a verbal analogy that only a man-made tent transmits impurity, deriving the word tent written with regard to impurity imparted by a corpse from the tent written with regard to the tabernacle. So he's going to look at two verses, Numbers 19:14 and Exodus 40:19. So it is written here with regard to impurity imparted by a corpse. This is the teaching when a man dies in a tent. And it is written there with regard to the tabernacle, right? The holy place where we kept the Ark of the Covenant in the wilderness, the tabernacle. And it is written there with regard to the tabernacle, and he spread the tent over the tabernacle, Exodus 40:19. So just as there with regard to the tabernacle, the tent was established by a person, so too here with regard to impurity of a corpse, it is a tent established by a person. And according to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, because the passage dealing with impurity imparted by a corpse, in the passage of impurity imparted by a corpse, the word tent is mentioned several times, not just once. So we don't have to look elsewhere to understand the definition of tent with regard to a corpse, since it is repeated several times in the laws of a person dying in a tent. These repeated uses of the word tent amplify the meaning of the word tent so that it comes to include any structure that provides shelter, even if it is not a standard tent, right? So in other words, if there's two people in a cave, one of them dies, the other one does become ritually impure, even if he doesn't touch the corpse. So the Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yehuda hold that the legal status of any tent that is not established by a person is not that of a tent? Right? That's what we've said so far. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, if it's established by natural causes, it won't impart impurity if there's a corpse there. And now the Gemara is even questioning that premise. No, you misunderstood what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Why? So the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishna. And the Mishna is from Para 3:2, meaning these are the laws of the red heifer, right? So when the temples were standing and or the tabernacle was standing, and a person could only enter the tabernacle or the temple compound if they were in a state of ritual purity, if they were tahor, if they came into contact with a dead body, or they shared a tent with a dead body, or they walked over the grave of a dead body, they would become tameh. Also, if they touched a dead creeping thing, or had certain bodily fluid emissions, etc., or touched someone that had, they would become tameh, and they would have to go through a purification process before they could enter the temple. If they came into contact with a corpse, either walking over a grave or sharing an indoor space with a corpse, or actually touching the corpse, so that's corpse impurity, corpse tuma, and the only way you could get purified from that is to go through a 7-day purification that included a sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th days of the waters of purification, which was pure water, pure spring water, mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. The red heifer was a very special cow that was completely red, kind of a rust color, no other colors in its hide, that had never been used for farm work or any other kind of work, that is slaughtered in a special place on the Mount of Olives, and then after it is slaughtered, it is burned, and the ashes of the red heifer are, stored in a very special way, and some of those ashes mixed with the pure spring water, and then with a bunch of hyssop leaves and branches, a priest would sprinkle you with those waters, and then, and only then, you would become tahor, ritually pure, and you were permitted then to enter the temple compound, at least as far as non-priests could go. Okay, so with regard to the laws of the waters of purification, we've talked in the past about the red heifer and how they had a special place for burning the red heifer, and they went to enormous lengths to make sure that red heifer would never come into contact with a body, with a corpse, or even walk over a grave, so that it would be rendered impure and disqualified for, becoming the red heifer that could be burned and provide the ashes for the waters of purification. And they actually built a special bridge from the Temple Mount all the way to the Mount of Olives, so that the cow would never have to walk over the ground where it might walk over a grave. And there were arches in that bridge which would act as a tent. That's what's good about a tent. If you're in a tent with a dead body, okay, you will become tameh by sharing a space with that corpse. But the tent itself will stop the impurity from traveling up. It'll travel up through dirt. If you walk over a grave, you would become tameh. But if the corpse was in a tent and you happen to fly over the tent, you would not become tameh. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the extreme lengths they took to keep the red heifer pure. Now we're going to talk about the extreme lengths they went to make sure that the water was pure when it was used to create the waters of purification. And this is going to relate to the tent and eventually get back to the sukkah. Okay, so courtyards were built in Jerusalem atop the rock, and beneath these courtyards there was a space of at least a handbreadth due to the concern lest there is a grave in the depth. So this is Tuma of the deep. And the idea there is, well, a body might have gotten buried in this spot, 1,000 years ago, and we would never know, right? Because maybe there was a battle here, and soldiers died, and then they got buried, and then, there were many sandstorms and, layers of rock and dirt and stuff, what archaeologists dig down through, and we don't even know if there's a body down there below, but even rock will not, interfere with tuma rising up from a grave. But a space like a tent or a shelter would. So they would create these dormitories, essentially. We'll explain why in a moment. But they would create these dormitories like this, in this picture here, right? And you see that they have these arches in the foundation of the dormitories. And this is so that even if there was a hidden grave that they don't know about down there deep below the dormitories, nevertheless, the tuma of those graves, the ritual impurity of those graves, would not reach the residents of these dormitories. Why did they do that? So courtyards were built in Jerusalem atop the rock, and beneath these courtyards there was a space of at least a handbreadth due to the concern lest there is a grave in the depths. And in that case, the space served as a barrier, preventing the impurity from reaching the courtyards above. Why did they do this? And they would bring pregnant women, and they would give birth there in those courtyards, and they would raise their children there. And they would not leave there with their children until the children grew. In this case, till they became about 7 or 8 years old. And all this was done so that the children would be untainted by any impurity and would be able to assist in the ritual of the red heifer, whose ashes are used to purify those who become impure with the impurity imparted by a corpse. So these were women and families, I assume, who would, go way above and beyond. I mean, they were real zealots. And who sort of like, it's like volunteering to live on the International Space Station, right? Or when there's a moon colony or a Mars colony established. They're volunteering to live there and to raise their kids there until those kids are 7 or 8 years old. Why? So now what we have is children who have never come into contact, guaranteed never to have come into contact with ritual impurity in their whole lives. This is not, it's sort of beyond what is necessary. It's a level of zeal that they went, great lengths that they went to make sure. Now, you should understand that it's not like this was done in every generation. There were only 9 red heifers in all the history of Israel. Right, of ancient Israel. So only when there was the tabernacle, the first temple, and the second temple. That's about a 1,200-year span. So during those 1,200 years, maybe 1,300 years, in all that time, there were 9 red heifers. Because, a cow is large, and when they burn it, that's a lot of ash. They only need a little bit of ash in any kind of mixture of the waters of purification. So it would last for generations. So it's only when there's like, we're like running low, we're going to need a red heifer. Red heifers are extremely rare, but when, the stockpile of ashes of red heifer, it got really low, a red heifer would appear in the world. They would make sure that it was kept pure, it was never worked, and they would have these children at that time, raised for 7 or 8 years in a state of absolute purity. So that why? So that when those children went to draw the water that would be mixed with the ashes of the red heifer, and now that I think about it, maybe this was happening more often than once every many generations, because the ashes would last a long time, but not necessarily the water. So I don't know, maybe they had them in many generations, and there were families that would volunteer for this service. It's crazy, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. I mean, it just means that they would make sure the kid never left the dormitory until they were 7. Terrible, from the kid's point of view, but whatever. There were families who did this, okay? So it happened. And how did they do it? And once they reached the age of 7 or 8, and were capable of assisting in the performance of this ritual, and that was like the sort of like the perfect age. They're old enough that they understand what's going on and they can assist in the performance of the ritual. And they're young enough so that there's no chance that they've had a nocturnal emission, a seminal emission. They're too young for that. They haven't had puberty. And so that this was the right age for them. And once they reached age 7 or 8 and were capable of assisting the performance of this ritual, the priests would bring oxen there. And they would place doors on the backs of these oxen. All right, so here we go. You see the child on a door on an ox, right? What's the door all about? Why is the child on a door? And basically that door is going to constitute a tent. It's the roof of a tent. So what's beneath it is like the space of a tent. It's like a ceiling for whatever is beneath it. And therefore, if that ox on its way from the kids' dormitory to the spring where they draw the water is going to, walk over one of these hidden graves that nobody knows about but could conceivably be there, that tuma will still not reach the child because it's going to pass through the airspace of a tent, of a structure underneath a ceiling, and therefore, the child remains pure. And so they would place doors on the backs of these oxen, and the children would sit upon the doors, and they would hold cups of stone which are not susceptible to ritual impurity, unlike cups made of wood or clay or glass or metal, in their hands. And when they reached the Siloam pool, they descended Siloam, the Siloam pool. Okay, so the pool of Siloam. When they reached the pool of Siloam, they descended into the water and filled the cups with water. And they ascended and sat themselves on the doors. So the water in the cups was mixed with the ashes of the heifer and used for sprinkling on the impure person or vessels. Rabbi Yosei says the children did not descend from their oxen. Rather, each child from his place on the door would lower the cup with a rope and fill it with water due to the concern lest there is a grave in the depths beneath the path leading from the oxen to the pool. So the oxen would get right up to the pool, but then if the kid was to get off the ox and go over to the water and fill his stone cup with water, he might have walked over one of these hidden graves. Better he should stay on top of that door, which is on top of the ox, with a cup attached to a string, and sort of lower that cup over the edge of the door and into the water. That's what Rabbi Yosei says. And it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says they would not bring doors. Rather, they would bring only oxen. The size of the spinal column and the body of the animal was sufficient to constitute a tent, and therefore served as a barrier before the impurity imparted by a grave in the depths. And this is difficult, as aren't oxen a tent that is not established by a person? And we learned in our Mishnah that we're discussing that Rabbi Yehuda says, in our Mishnah that we're discussing, Rabbi Yehuda says that if there is a tent that is established not by the hand of man, then it does not, and you share that space with the corpse, that you would not receive impurity from the corpse. But if it's not a tent in which you could, get corpse tuma by being under the same roof with it, it would also not be a tent for the purposes of being a barrier to tuma rising from a grave beneath the ground. And here Rabbi Yehuda is saying in this Mishnah about the oxen and the door and the child on top of it, that they don't even need the door because the oxen itself acts like a tent. And it's a contradiction because, if you put the door on top of the oxen, then that is acting like a tent and it was created by people. But if the kid is just riding on top of the oxen and on top of the ox, and the ox itself acts as a tent, it might be a tent, but it wasn't created by people to be a tent. It's just an ox that the kid happens to be riding on. And if Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's saying that it wasn't necessary to put the door on top of the ox because the ox acts as a tent, that would contradict Rabbi Yehuda saying over in our Mishnah that if it's not created by the hand of man as a tent, it doesn't function like a tent. Because here he's saying the ox functions like a tent. And then obviously the ox was not created by the hand of man. The ox was created by God. And this is difficult, as aren't oxen a tent that is not established by humans? And it is taught that Rabbi Yehuda says they did not bring doors, rather they brought only oxen. Apparently, the legal status of a tent that is not man-made is that of a tent, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Elazar said, Rabbi Yehuda concedes that the legal status of a tent that is not man-made is that of a tent when the tent is a fist breadth. And a fist breadth is more than a hand breadth. I guess when you make a fist, it's a little wider. And also when you talk about a fist breadth, it's not just a hand breadth is just length, right? The width of your hand, whatever that is, call it 4 or 5 inches. That's what we measure with a hand breadth. But a fist breadth seems to have volume. It's not only wide, it also has height and width, 3 dimensions. And so a fist breadth is more than a hand breadth in terms of length, width, and height. And it is only when the tent is less than the size of a fist that Rabbi Yehuda holds that it is not a tent. And that opinion is also taught in a Baraisa. And in another Baraisa it says, and Rabbi Yehuda concedes, in the case of caves and deep cavities in the rocks, that their status is that of a tent, even though they are not man-made. So whoever told us that Rabbi Yehuda says that if it's a naturally occurring shelter or with an interior, that it doesn't transmit, corpse tuma of a tent, seems that contradicts this Baraisa where Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that does count as a tent, those kind of interior spaces that are not man-made. And the Gemara asks, but with regard to the door on the back of the ox that the child is riding for this drawing water for the ashes of the red heifer ceremony, but a door on the back of an ox is an object that measures more than several fist breadths, and it is taught that Rabbi Yehuda says they did not bring doors. They only needed the oxen to act as a tent interposing between the grave below and the child on top. So apparently a door does not constitute a tent, since that is not the manner in which a tent is typically established. So Abaye said in response that Rabbi Yehuda did not say that the legal status of the door is not that of a tent. Rather, he said they did not need to bring doors. If they brought the doors, that would certainly function as a tent. But they did not need to bring doors because the oxen themselves were sufficiently wide to act as a tent. Rava said that Rabbi Yehuda's statement should be explained differently. According to Rava, they would not bring doors at all because a child has an exaggerated sense of self-confidence due to the width of the door. He might allow himself to move from side to side, and as a result, perhaps he will extend his head or his arms, one of his limbs, beyond the edge of the door, and then he will become impure because the ox happened to walk over one of these hidden graves. Now the child extends over the side, right? Children are children, kids will be kids. That's what Rava is saying. And right, so again, if you get this picture of the child on the door, on the ox, right? The problem with the door is that the kid might just kind of move around on the door. He won't stay still. He's up there by himself after all. And if he leans out over the door, then we can't be 100% sure that the kid didn't get a corpse tumor by virtue of walking over, passing over a grave. And there was no tent space, no interior space interposing between the child and that hidden grave. And so therefore they didn't use those doors, and it was better that just have the kid riding on the ox, because the kid knows that, an ox is a rounded top. If he leans out to the side, he's going to fall off, so he's very much going to keep himself centered on the middle of the ox. And in the title of today's show, I called it the Bullriding Children of Jerusalem. Obviously, the oxen that were used for this were extremely docile and stable, and they had no problem just sitting on the ox and staying there. Where am I? The Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rava. As Rabbi Yehuda says, they would not bring doors at all. Why? Because a child has an exaggerated sense of self-confidence, and perhaps he will extend his head or one of his limbs beyond the edge of the door, and he will become impure with the tuma of the deep, right? The impurity imparted by a grave in the depths. Rather, what they would do is bring Egyptian oxen whose bellies are very broad, and the children would sit upon them, and they would hold cups of stone in their hands, and when they reached the Siloam pool, they descended and filled them, and ascended and sat themselves on the backs of the oxen. Right? So the way they actually got there was the kid just rode on the Egyptian ox, which is wide. And so at all times that they're riding over the dirt or stone where there might be a hidden grave that no one knows about, the space underneath the belly of the ox acts as this interposition to stop Tuma of the deep from reaching the child on the back of the ox. The Gemara asks, but with regard to a bed, now we're getting back to what we were talking about, a bed inside a sukkah, and whether if you sleep under the bed, you fulfill your obligation. But with regard to a bed, which measures several fist breadths, didn't we learn in the Mishna that Rabbi Yehuda says it was our custom that we would sleep beneath the bed before the elders, and the elders would not say no. And therefore we did fulfill our obligation even though we were sleeping under the bed. So apparently, despite the fact that a bed measures several handbreadths, its legal status is not that of a tent. So we've already established where this law got to is that if you sleep under a bed inside a sukkah and the space between the bottom of the bed and the floor underneath is 10 handbreadths or more, then that space under the bed is like a tent, and you have not fulfilled your obligation to sleep in the sukkah if you sleep under that bed, because that space is significant. But now we see there's a problem, right? And if the bed is lower than the 10 handbreadths, then it's not considered a significant space. And it's like you might be under the bed, but really what you're sleeping in, the space that you're sleeping in, is under the roof of the sukkah, and that's why you fulfill your obligation. Well, but under the belly of the Egyptian ox that this kid is riding on in order to remain pure and draw the water for the waters of purification, is the belly of the ox more than 10 handbreadths high? No, it's not. It could be easily lower than that. So why does that count as a tent that is going to stop the rise of impurity from that hidden grave, but the space underneath the bed is not considered significant if it's less than 10 handbreadths? And we actually already have seen the answer to this question. And the answer is that the laws of Tumah and ritual impurity and corpse impurity are special laws given to Moses by God at Mount Sinai. Some of those original laws of the oral tradition that were transmitted, Lemoshe, to Moshe, Sinai, from Mount Sinai, at Mount Sinai by God. And so we can't actually learn. This whole digression is very interesting, but we're not going to be able to learn out exactly, because the bottom line is, in terms of corpse tumah and stopping tumah rising from a grave, a empty space with a ceiling, even if it's just going to be, I think, like 1 fist breadth high, is going to be enough to stop the tumah. But in terms of sleeping under a bed inside a sukkah, if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it's not significant. Once it reaches 10 handbreadths, then it is a significant space, and it would stop you from fulfilling your obligation to sleep in the sukkah. But the Gemara is going to give a different answer now. Why are these different? And the Gemara answers, a bed is different since it is designed specifically for use above it. Therefore, the status of the space beneath it is not that of a tent. And the Gemara asks, well, aren't oxen, like those used to transport the children to bring water for the red heifer, also designated specifically for use above them, right? The kids ride on top of the ox, not under the ox. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda deems the body of the ox to act like a tent that prevents corpse tumah, grave tumah, from rising up through the ox to the child. When Ravin came to Babylonia from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, he said that Rabbi Elazar said, oxen are different, since they protect the shepherds in the sun from the sun, and in the rain from the rain. So in other words, oxen, actually the space underneath an ox does have an established purpose, in that are they called cow herds, right? The people who herd cattle herds, cowboys, right? But the people who, tend the cows, the cattle, the oxen in the fields for, extended amounts of time away from other shelters, when it's very sunny or when it's rainy, they might actually get underneath an ox to get out of the sun or to get out of the rain. So that space already has an established human purpose. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, if an ox is rendered a tent because it provides protection, even if its primary designation is for people riding on top of it, well, then the status of a bed also should be that of a tent, since it does protect the shoes and sandals that are placed beneath it. People often use a storage area under a bed. So even if it's less than 10 handbreadths, since it's an established place that gets used, shouldn't that render it a significant space? And even if it's less than 10 handbreadths and you sleep under the bed, that should prevent you from fulfilling your obligation to sleep in the sukkah. Rather, Rava rejected that explanation, and he said oxen are different, and their status is that of a tent because their bellies and their backs are made to protect their innards. As it is stated, Job 10:11, with skin and flesh you have clothed me, and with bones and sinews you have knitted me together. So since flesh and skin are mentioned in the verse as providing shelter, the status of the oxen is that of a tent. And if you wish, say instead, in this case, Rabbi Yehuda conforms to his reasoning elsewhere. As he said, we require a sukkah that is a permanent residence. The bed in a sukkah is a temporary residence, and the sukkah is a permanent tent. Permanent in the sense that during the week of Sukkot, you dwell in it, right? Whereas the bed, you only sleep in it at night. So the bed in a sukkah is a temporary residence, and the sukkah is a permanent tent. And a temporary tent does not come and negate a permanent tent. The permanent sukkah is significant, and that significance supersedes any temporary structure within it. Therefore, in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, the status of the bed, meaning the space under the bed, is not that of a tent and doesn't prevent you from fulfilling your obligation if you sleep there. The Gemara asks, but according to Rabbi Shimon, who also stated that we require a sukkah that is a permanent residence, nevertheless, a temporary tent comes and negates a permanent tent. And the Gemara answers, like if you build a tent inside your sukkah, it's going to negate the sukkah. And the Gemara answers, yes, and that is the point over which they disagree. One sage, Rabbi Shimon, holds a temporary tent comes and negates a permanent tent. And the other sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds a temporary tent does not come and negate a permanent tent. Right? So like the canopy over a 4-poster bed, that would definitely negate you sleeping under the roof of the sukkah. But maybe according to Rabbi Yehuda, it wouldn't, because that's just a temporary tent that you use at night, and it won't negate you sleeping under the sukkah. Now, Rabbi Yehuda did not win this argument. That's a minority view. You can't sleep under a bed that's more than 10 handbreadths off the ground. You can't sleep under a canopy if it has a horizontal surface of 1 handbreadth or more. And the Mishnah relates that Rabbi Shimon said, contrary to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, there was an incident involving Tavi, the Canaanite slave of Rabban Gamliel, who was sleeping beneath the bed, and Rabban Gamliel claimed that his slave Tavi did so because he was a Torah scholar, and he knew that slaves are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. And it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon said, from the conversation of Rabban Gamliel, we learn 2 matters. We learn that Canaanite slaves are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah, and we learn that one who sleeps beneath the bed did not fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara questions the formulation of the Baraisa. And why didn't Rabbi Shimon say from the statement of Rabban Gamliel? Why did he use the atypical expression from the conversation of Rabban Gamliel? And the Gemara answers, through this expression, he teaches us another matter in passing, like that which Rabbi Acha bar Ada said, and some say Rabbi Acha bar Ada said that Rabbi Chamnuna said that Rav said. From where is it derived that even the conversation of Torah scholars requires analysis, even when the intention of the speaker was apparently not to issue a legal ruling? It is as it is stated with regard to the righteous. Psalms 1:3, which brings forth its fruit in its season and whose leaf does not wither. And this teaches that with regard to a Torah scholar, not only is his primary product his fruit, meaning when he's teaching on purpose, but even ancillary matters that stem from his conversation, his leaves, are significant. His primary teachings, what he's teaching when he's meaning to teach, that's his fruit. But even his conversation is like his leaves, which does not wither, and you can learn from really righteous people just from their casual conversation. You can learn from them, and you should analyze their conversation to see what you can learn from them. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1. Now we're near the bottom of page 21b, and we're going to just read a very short Mishnah, Mishnah number 2, and do just the beginnings of that discussion so that we can say we did the whole daf, okay? And so I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. Mishnah number 2, one who supports his sukkah on the legs of the bed, i.e. he leans the sukkah roofing on a bed, the sukkah is fit. It is a fit sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says that the sukkah cannot stand in and of itself without support of the bed. It is unfit. Rabbi Yehuda is going to lose this argument too. And what we're talking about now is a sukkah that is a bed. It's only a bed, right? The whole floor of the sukkah is a bed, and the sukkah is above the bed. So is that a sukkah, yes or no? The rabbis say, yes, that's a sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says no, because if you took the bed away, the sukkah would not be there. That's their argument. That's the whole Mishnah, the Gemara. And the Gemara asks, what is the rationale for the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that this kind of sukkah is unfit? And Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Abba Bar Memel disagree with regard to his rationale. One of them said it is unfit because it lacks permanence. The sukkah is not stable enough, as if the bed is moved, the sukkah will collapse. And one said it is unfit because he is supporting the roofing with an object that is susceptible to ritual impurity, as the bed frame is a vessel. So according to this rationale, not only the roofing of the sukkah, which we've discussed, has to be made of a material that is not susceptible to ritual impurity, but even that which supports the roofing as well may not be susceptible to ritual impurity. Now we know this is not so. How do we know? Because there are many sukkahs that the poles of the sukkah that hold up the sukkah are made of metal. Right? Metal poles are metal utensils. They are susceptible to ritual impurity. And, there's hundreds of thousands of kosher sukkahs in the world, perhaps millions, that are made of metal poles in terms of the vertical poles, right? What holds up the roofing. So the person who's explaining that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that because there's a bed underneath, a bed is definitely a vessel or utensil. It is susceptible to ritual impurity. And since it's a bed that's holding up all the roofing, since the poles that hold up the roofing are now also the corner posts of the bed, so it's like the bed is holding up the roofing. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, maybe it's because the bed is a vessel. And if so, perhaps we are meant to learn that the supports of the roofing also have to be made of a material like wood that's not really manufactured, it's only cut, that cannot be a vessel susceptible to impurity. The Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between these two explanations of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? And the Gemara explains the difference is in a case where one wedged iron skewers or iron poles into the ground and roofed the sukkah upon them. According to the one who said that the reason the sukkah is unfit is because it lacks permanence, well, if you made it with metal poles, it's sturdy enough, it's permanent enough, and therefore that sukkah is fit. However, according to the one that explained Rabbi Yehuda's opinion by saying that the reason the sukkah is unfit is because he is supporting the roofing with an object that is susceptible to ritual impurity, now he's supporting it with an object that is susceptible to ritual impurity, these metal poles, and therefore the sukkah would be not fit. That is definitely not the halakha. Abaye said, and this is the last paragraph, the sages taught this dispute only in a case where one leaned the roofing on the bed. However, if one placed the roofing directly atop the bed, i.e. he affixed poles to the bed and the roofing is supported by those poles, then everyone agrees that the sukkah is fit. So this would be Abaye saying that what Rabbi Yehuda was talking about is where you have two poles just standing on the ground holding up the roofing of the sukkah, and on the other side there's two poles that are just kind of like placed on top of the middle of the bed. Now, if you took the bed away, the whole sukkah would collapse. And in that case, he would say that the sukkah is unfit. But if it's like the picture that I showed you, where there's a bed with four corner posts, and those posts go up farther and they hold up the sukkah roofing, that would be okay, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, says Abaye. And what is the reason that it is fit? According to the one who said that the sukkah is unfit because it lacks permanence, the sukkah is sturdy. as even if the bed is moved, the roofing will move with it and it will not collapse. And according to the one who said that the sukkah is unfit because he supports it with an object that is susceptible to ritual impurity, in this case, he is not supporting it with an object that is susceptible to ritual impurity, as the roofing is not supported by the bed, it's supported by the poles, which also happen to hold up the bed frame, but the poles extend down to the floor. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. It was a long class, but we did the whole daf. Let me see if we have any comments or questions on page 21. Sharon, it makes sense if we equate tent to shelter, but how can we say a cave is a tent? How can we say a cave is a tent? Well, if what we're saying is that you have you're inside an interior that is a shelter that has a ceiling, that's what makes a cave like a tent. Bottom line, where they come out on the law is that if you're in a cave with another person, that person dies, you would become ritually impure because you're under the same ceiling, the same roof with that person, even though no human created this tent. It's just a tent for the purposes of this law of corpse tuma in a tent. Sharon also says, were these kids children of Kohanim or any child? What kind of ritual training did they get? Excellent question. I don't know. I'd have to read more about it. I don't know the answer to your question. There is a book about this subject. I have it. I just haven't looked at it lately. Called like The Ox, the Boy, and the Door or something like that. And it's, I forget which rabbi wrote it. Interesting writer talking about these kind of crazy scenarios that would enter our history in order to fulfill these laws. This extreme purity that they, like making sure that the kids are absolutely pure, it wasn't really necessary. But the reason they got there was actually a little bit political. What happened was, originally there were these Sadducees that did not submit to the authority of the rabbis and didn't believe in the oral law and the history of the oral law and the oral tradition. And so in order to show that the Sadducees are wrong and the rabbis who, dictate what Jewish law is, they would actually make a priest impure on the day that the red heifer was being burned, and then have him go, immerse in the mikveh, and then go out and slaughter the red heifer. And he didn't have to wait until nightfall, because that wasn't necessary for his role in that ceremony. And they did that, and they didn't take that extra precaution of waiting till night so that even the Sadducees would be satisfied, because they didn't want to do anything. They were proving that the Sadducees were wrong. However, because it looked to other non-priests and non-rabbis and non-Sadducees like they might be being a little careless with the laws of the red heifer, then they instituted to say, well, we're going to show the public just how exacting and careful we'll be with the laws of purity. And then they instituted this whole thing of having kids raise their whole lives, never coming into contact with impurity, because they took the purity of the red heifer so seriously. And that's how we got to this whole story. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for our pre-Shabbos show at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, and hopefully we'll do 2 pages. They're short pages and there's a lot of technical stuff, so I won't be tempted to do everything on the page. As we see, when we do a whole page, it's a longer show and it requires a little more patience and a little more depth. But I'm glad you took this ride with me today. May you be blessed to learn many more pages of the Talmud, and may we be blessed to learn together again tomorrow. Have a great night.